So today's session is a very, very big session, or very big topic for gardening and gardeners of all kinds. We're going to be talking about making good soil, making good garden soil. So we're going to be talking about structure. We're going to be talking about functional soil. You know, what's the difference between a soil that's functional, that's alive, that's actually, helping your plants to grow, or one that just doesn't absorb water, doesn't absorb air. And we're also going to be talking about the capacity to sequester atmospheric carbon in garden soil. Agricultural soils, if done in a particular way, can actually be a great benefit to environmental issues that we're facing today. And whether or not you're like, it's not everybody is like really concerned right now about the climate and all that stuff, but the thing is that adding carbon to soil actually enhances its function and reduces the cost to grow food. If you do it the natural way, the better way, it's a real game changer. Agriculture is a very ancient tradition. And from the start, from ancient Egypt, it actually didn't start in Egypt. It started in a bunch of different places around the world, Mesopotamia in particular, in Mexico, in Peru, in China. There's a bunch of different places in the world where agriculture got its start. Um, and from the start, in a lot of different places, especially in Mesopotamia and throughout Europe and Asia, tillage has always been a very ancient tradition in managing garden soil. There are some consequences to too much tillage. It disrupts soil structure, and this led to the big dust bowl. Sorry about that. In the 1930s, in the Great Plains in the West, in the Prairie provinces in Canada and the plains in the U.S. They had been doing tillage agriculture there for a few hundred years, and they wouldn't replenish. They just till, add their seeds, harvest, and then repeat every year. And basically, every time you harvest from your garden, from your agricultural land, you're removing nutrients from the land. So if it's never replenished, it can deteriorate extremely rapidly. And when you till soil, you stir it up, you add oxygen to it. A lot of the organic matter, the carbon based organic matter in soil actually ends up getting consumed by soil organisms. Adding oxygen to soil activates them, hypercharges them. And now, if you have an abundance of organic material in your soil, it doesn't bother right away. But every time you till, the organic content of soil is reduced a little bit every time. And in time, like what happened here in the prairies, is that basically there was no more structure left, no more organic matter left. The soil dried out and became unable to absorb water, and ended up, creating a drought, a drought throughout that whole eco zone. And basically, farmers lost their livelihoods. They lost their farms. It was the Great Depression. There was a lot of issues going on, and just no support, no help for farmers. And then that's where it triggered a lot of new methods, new ways of doing things, trying to correct those errors of the past. Erosion, soil degradation, and contamination of waterways. That's what landscape-wide tillage does to soil. So here you see in the photograph on the left, you see a rivulet of water running through in a slightly low area in your in the field, in freshly tilled field. What happens, especially here in places like here when we have a winters, if you till, a lot of farmers will till their soil in the fall because it's hard to go out and till soil early in the spring because it's too muddy, too wet. You can't get the tractors out there. So a lot of farmers, what they do is they get a jump start on that and they'll till it in the fall. But what happens there? You get a snowpack on top of your soil. And as soon as it melts, a lot of that soil gets washed away, and a very important volume of arable soil is eroded away and falls into waterways. It fills pools in waterways, especially in trout and salmon waters, like we have here in our streams and rivers. The pools where the cool, cold water pools where salmon and trout like to live get filled in all the way up, and you end up with a river that no longer has deep pools. The water tends to be warm, muddy. There's no, the habitats are completely degraded. And that's where we see a lot of our reduction in population for salmon and trout in our area. This has been happening for a period of time. Deforestation, all of these things contribute to that. But agricultural land is one of the major contributors to these issues. And I mean, it's harmful to fish, and that's sad. My bigger concern, though, is the loss of productivity of that agricultural soil. This is that farmer's retirement funds. That's profits that he could have had in his pocket that are washing away. And because the good quality soil is being reduced every season that this is done, it becomes harder and harder, needing more and more inputs to keep this degraded land productive. So that's profit margins for the farmer that are shrinking exponentially. And over time, a lot of soils end up being no longer really functional. It can be a huge problem over the long term. Organic matter decomposition is the foundation of soil fertility. So, we all know about compost and how it all works, but where does that come from? So if you look in your woodlands, um, everything that you see every fall, all the leaves fall to the ground and sit on the soil surface in a beautiful layer of mulch. Every year this accumulates, and every year it's continuously added to it. If you get down on the ground in the forest floor and open up the leaves and start digging a little bit, you'll get past the leaves and the decomposed leaves, and you'll get into a layer of dark black soil, really rich humus. It's called. It's a humus, not hummus like you made out of chickpeas, but humus. So that's what we're trying to simulate when we make compost. Basically, it's organic matter that falls to the ground with the addition, like the majority of the matter is leaf debris. It's dead leaf matter or dead plant matter with a small addition of manure from birds, deer, bears, moose, everything that lives in the forest. Their manure on the ground would decompose and adds the nitrogen needed for the proper decomposition of all of this matter, and together with the rotting leaves, it creates this beautiful humus. So when we want to make compost for our garden, basically we want to look at that proportion. Because first of all, everything that's alive, absolutely every organism on earth that is alive, their cells are mostly composed of carbon molecules. So the carbon will attach to all kinds of different nutrients and things and create these long chain molecules that we can build the proteins and all of our different cells in our bodies, in the plants, the cell walls, everything is all made out of carbon. So everything that is made out of carbon that was once alive can be composted. Now, there are certain little rules that we want to stick to make an easier time of composting. There are some things that are better to put in your backyard compost, even though everything can decompose and can become soil. Not everything does it well or does it without being smelly, and other issues like that. And we'll go into that in a minute here. But basically, if you ask yourself, well, can I put this in my compost? Will it decompose? I can answer you right now. If it was once alive, yes, it can decompose. It's just you want to take a look at what it's made out of, and consider the balance, because the proportion of how much carbon to nitrogen you put into your compost pile will have a big impact on how hot it'll cook, how smelly it's going to be, and how quickly it'll be ready. So compost is a natural process that transforms organic matter into valuable product for gardening. So building compost, making compost for your backyard garden, for your market garden, for your farm. These are skills that everybody who wants to produce food, who wants to grow food, it's one of those critical skills that you need to know how to do in order to do it cost effectively. If you're buying compost out of a bag, or you're buying a truckload to deliver the compost to your garden, I mean, the cost can get very significant. And I'm assuming that most folks want a garden in order to reduce their cost of living. So this is how the biggest part of reducing your cost of living with gardening is by making your own compost. And once you start making compost, it just becomes a regular part of your gardening schedule in certain times of year. You know, in the fall, you're not going to be putting your leaves at the road. You're going to be taking everybody else's leaves that they leave at the road, and you're going to bring them all to your house, and you're going to make compost out of that. You're going to keep your grass clippings when you cut your lawn. You're going to pile them up, and you're going to put them in your compost pile. It's just going to become a habit of always taking all of that organic matter. It's not a waste. It's a resource. And if you see it that way, that these are resources to be harvested in order to cut your costs, then you start to notice, you know, different all kinds of different sources that you could harvest from in order to bring in that nutrition to your garden. So the proportion carbon to nitrogen is 20-1. You want 20 parts of carbon rich material for 1 part of nitrogen rich material. That's your browns and your greens. So your browns, your carbon browns, now you're looking at leaves and hay and straw, shredded paper, newspapers, cardboard, you know, pretty much anything like that that's dry, that's dead, dry, desiccated, and just basically just a rough, dry material. These are carbon-rich materials. So what you want to do is you want to have a thick layer of carbon-rich material, and you add to that a very thin little layer of nitrogen material, which would be stuff like manure from all kinds of different farm animals. We mostly will choose manures from ruminants instead of predators. So your dog or your cat manure would not be a good thing to add to your compost. There are things in your predators manures that can be harmful in compost, and not necessarily what you're looking for. But cow manure, horse manure, chicken manure is fantastic. Worm manure, vermicompost is a magnificent, one of the best manures to use in gardening. So manures concentrate nutrients, they concentrate nitrogen, and it's the nitrogen in the manure that activates the whole composting process. Without your nitrogen element, it doesn't get hot. You want your compost to get hot, because there your compost will start to cook your weed seeds. It'll cook any diseases or blights or problems that might have arisen in your garden materials, in your garden plants when you remove them from your garden in the fall. You know, so you don't want to be, if you know your compost is going to get hot, you're not worried about putting your blighty tomato leaves into your compost pile. You can do that. You know, you just have to make sure that you have enough nitrogen in your compost so that it gets hot. So not everybody's comfortable with proportions. So basically, 20 to 1 is 95% of the volume is carbon rich, just 5% is manure. So the majority of what you're putting into your compost is going to be like just dry stuff, leaves and hay and straw and all of that stuff. That's pretty easy to source. Sometimes getting enough nitrogen material, manure, might not necessarily be easy to get depending on where you live. Sometimes if you live out in the country and you have farms nearby, you can always go knock on the door and, hey, can I take a truckload or a trailer load of your manure back to my garden? Or if you're just making a small, 4 foot by 4 foot by 4 foot compost pile, you might only need like a bin full of manure in order to make it work. Now, just so you know, no matter how much compost you're making, it's never enough. So always aim big. Don't go for the tiny little compost tumbler there, because those never produce enough volume of compost to be useful in the garden, and they're actually usually not big enough in order for it to get warm, to get hot. So nitrogen materials that are the materials that are rich in nitrogen that are alternate to manures. If you can't get manure, something else that's really good for as a substitute for manure, freshly cut grass. Everybody's got a lawn, right? So you can cut your lawn, keep your fresh cut grasses, and substitute your grass for your manure. It'll work just fine. Another good source is everybody's got, and now don't judge me, but urine, human urine. You can get everybody to pee in a bucket, and fill it up with water, 20 parts of water for the volume of urine. Urine is very rich in nitrogen and phosphorus and all kinds of other nutrients, provided you're collecting urine from people who are healthy, who are not taking cancer medications or strong medications or heavy drugs or anything like that. People who don't have like urinary tract infection and that kind of stuff. You want to collect from folks who are healthy. If you have access to that, then you can always boost your nitrogen levels in your compost pile. If the compost pile, you built it and it's just not getting warm, and folks sometimes might panic a little bit. It's just not heating up. It's not heating up. Well, that's why I'm bringing up urine. It's a simple and quick solution. You take a shovel handle, take the handle, you stick it in the middle of your compost pile, open up a hole, and take your bucket full of watered down urine. You can just pour it down into the middle of that hole in your compost pile. The urine will seep into the rest of your material and activate it. And next thing you know, there's steam, there's smoke coming out of your compost pile. It's heating up to a temperature that will actually sanitize and prepare your compost, get it nice and hot, and really activate it so that it gets going. So the minimum size that you need in order for it to start to warm up is 1 cubic meter. That would be 3 foot wide, 3 foot long, and 3 foot deep. That's your minimum. I would recommend you go much bigger than that because it'll shrink. Once it starts to heat up, the compost pile will reduce in volume and shrink to about a third of its original size. So I try to, when I make my compost at home, my composter is about 8 feet long, 4 feet deep, and 4 foot or 5 foot tall. And I usually will fill all of that, I raise chickens, I raise geese. So I'll take a lot of fall leaves. I collect about 300 to 400 bags of leaves every fall. And half of them go in the garden for mulch. The other half goes into the chicken coop as bedding. And that bedding, it's like a carbon-rich diaper that absorbs all of the smelly stuff, the urine and the manure and all of that stuff, and you keep a good layer of clean material for the birds to walk around on, and they're not walking around and sitting on their own poop all winter long. And in the spring, you just collect that, throw that into your compost pile, add extra, extra carbon matter, more leaves and hay and straw, and just build it up as big as possible. And within, usually I'll do that in the fall. I'll make a pile in the fall and make another one in the spring when I clean out the chicken coop in the spring. And the spring one, I'll do that. I'll clean out the chicken coop in April, in May, it's getting produced, and by by mid-May it's ready. It takes about a month to produce, a month or two, if you turn it a couple of times, and it'll be ready to be put out into the garden for your season. So there's a bacteria that lives in the compost and amongst the manures, that lives in that's actually going to do all of that work. The heat comes from the bacteria's activity. These bacteria, they're aerobic bacteria. We call them aerobic because they breathe oxygen, just like you and me. So they need air in the compost pile. So that's why if you get your compost pile too wet, it chokes out those beneficial bacteria that are trying to make your compost, and it'll get cold and smelly. If it's too hot or too warm or too dry, nothing happens. So you want your compost to be about as moist, like a face cloth. You ran water through it, and you squeezed out most of the water, and it's just damp to the touch there. Well, that's about the dampness that you want in your compost pile. If it gets rained on too much, and it's too wet, the thing to fix that is just to turn it once and fluff it up and add some more air in there, and then it'll kick up again. I would recommend that if you're making a compost pile, build it in a place that tends to be shady, on the north side of a building, in the shade underneath a big tree, or keep a tarp on top of it so that to prevent extra rain, too much rain to get on there, and also too much sun to get on it, to make sure that it's shady, so that it stays in a nice, damp, and aerated condition, and your compost will function just beautifully. So now, a lot of folks out here on the East Coast of the province here in New Brunswick, we have two different types of problematic soils to choose from. It'll be either sandy soil or it'll be heavy clay soil. Some of us are lucky we have like a loamy soil, but for the most part, we're working with very difficult soils to work with. Sandy soil drains very well, very good soil to plant deep rooted plants like carrots and turnips and that kind of thing. But the problem is sand drains so much that nutrients don't stay in there. If you can put some fertilizer on there, but then it rains and it will pretty much all washes away. Clay soils are the opposite problem. Clay soils are very high in nutrients. They absorb and attract nutrients. It's like there's a molecular bond that happens with nutrients, that clay soils are really good soils for growing nutritious vegetables. But the problem is that it's hard to get water in there. The clay, once it's dry, it's like a rock, and the water won't absorb. Once it's wet, it's hard to get it dry. It's a sloppy mess. So the way to correct both of these types of soils is the same remedy. Mix in some compost, mix in organic matter. In sandy soils, your compost, your manure, your peat moss, your compost is going to hold on to water. Water will come in and it'll absorb that water like a sponge. It'll hold on to nutrients because the water is staying there, and the water soluble nutrients are going to stay in place a lot more easily. And in clay soil, the organic matter that's mixed into the clay can absorb that water, expand, create cracks in the clay, allow more water to infiltrate through to it, and allow air to come in, to those nice and deep into that heavy clay. And it softens the clay. It makes it much more easy to work with. So what we try to do is, it's the same solution for both problematic soils, right? It just goes to show the power of compost. What's going on with your compost? It's not just that it's plant matter or that it's carbon matter. There are organisms that live in there, and they're actively trying to improve your garden soil. And those beneficial bacteria and nematodes and worms and mushrooms and all of these different things that are living in your compost and in your garden soil, they will mediate. They will adapt to change. They will create tunnels that allow air and water to infiltrate through. So adding that organic matter, it feeds that soil life. Living garden soil is the most beautiful chocolate cake soil. That's how you get your chocolate cake soil. You have to feed it. You have to feed it organic matter. One of the problems that we're having in commercial agriculture is that we've taken away the living parts, the living parts of soil, and we're only thinking about it in chemistry terms, right? So there we're talking about, it's dead soil. So we have to, substitute all of the services that nature, those organisms would have provided. We have to substitute all of that chemically. So, we doing chemical tests of our soil to see which nutrients are deficient, and we'll go buy bags of those things, load it up in our tractors and spread it all around. And it's a lot of work. It's very expensive. And it's one of the reasons why it's so the margins in farming are so small. You know, we've moved away from the animals on the land contributing that organic matter that in nature happens all the time. If you go back to that image in the beginning with the forest floor in the forest, nobody's tilling forest, nobody's fertilizing it. And yet those plants, those trees are growing 40, 50, 60, 80 feet tall, and that's why is that natural process is allowed to happen. And we can simulate that in our gardens. And by teaming up with those beneficial soil organisms, they do the majority of the work and frees us up, the gardeners, to do other things and have a life outside of the garden and then reduce our costs. If we're not buying uh, fertilizers and all of these things and big machines to spread it and take care of it, our costs become really, really minimal. At that point, is basically your biggest cost is your time, and your time already belongs to you, right? So if you're, not spending money on products to make your garden grow, your garden is taking care of you. There's an enormous diversity of beneficial organisms that naturally contribute to the fertility of the land. There's a whole cycle of nutrients of plants growing and dying and decomposing, being consumed by small organisms, small bacteria and fungi, and those get consumed by larger organisms, and earthworms and different things like that, and little microscopic little bugs, and those get consumed by birds and different little creatures running around the nature, and then they feed that back with their manures and all of that stuff, and it's a whole cycle. So I encourage, pairing up with nature, inviting birds into your garden. Most of the time, folks worry about birds in the garden. Oh, they're going to eat all of my plants. But if you look carefully, the birds are mostly eating bugs out of your garden. Um, I sat there one whole afternoon watching sparrows coming in and dive bombing and collecting all kinds of cucumber beetles and aphids and all kinds of little mosquitoes and bugs of all kinds and biting insects and different things that would have been a problem to me. They're there eating that for a living every day, all day long. So that's, and while they're doing it, they're dropping their little poopsies a little bit here and there, and that's a free source of phosphorus and potassium, and there's a lot of benefit from inviting nature into your garden. Not only is it good for the soul, the soil, it's good for the soul. So when you're in your garden and you're surrounded by living creatures, by pollinators and birds and all of these different things with flowering, plants and that all that beauty, it becomes a little uplifting. It's your sanctuary where you can go to retreat and not only feed your garden. Doesn't necessarily only feed your body, but it does feed the soul and the mind. You know, it's a therapeutic thing. It's a medicinal thing. Just that spending that time in that little paradise that you created for yourself and for all of those different organisms that are teamed up with you to help you in your project. So it's so important if you're going to try to team up with these soil-borne organisms to protect them, protect that soil. Oftentimes, especially in commercial agriculture, we leave soil bare. And I often use the metaphor like Mother Nature. She's a lady. Mother Earth should be covered at all times, either by living plants or by covered by plant matter or different mulches. Protect the soil surface from solar radiation, which will sanitize about a half inch of the soil surface is completely sanitized of all life. It's just mineral if it gets dried out by the sun. Temperatures on soil, especially garden soil, which is quite dark because of the albedo effect. The dark soil will actually increase in temperature. I've gone out into a garden, your traditional row garden, without mulch in it, and took a infrared temperature reader and measured temperatures of 50, 54, 56 degrees Celsius, which is, I mean, it's enough to cook the roots of lettuces and different things. And then you wonder why your lettuce is bitter and it's flowering, as soon as the warm weather comes, your lettuce is gone, your spinach is all bolted. Well, that's why. It's the water evaporates out, the soil is deprived of water, and because there's the soil surface is desiccated and without life, the plants don't get that support structure that it needs. So adding compost, adding mulches on the soil surface. So here in these images here, the one on the left is my rhubarb. What you see here is the weeds that were growing around my rhubarb. We would cut them at their base, flip them upside down, and put the base side up next to the plants, and the flowering stalks, they're face down into your walkway. So that way, if there are seeds on your weeds that you use as mulch, the seeds end up in your walkways and not amongst your plants on your garden bed. The photograph on the right is straw that's laid out between the plants of these are squash. And so basically, you just gather your material. Doesn't have to be fancy. Doesn't have to cost you anything. Basically, you can go out and you can go clean a field someplace and just grab material, pass a lawnmower, just grab that stuff and just throw it into your as a mulch around your plants. Keep those roots moist and protected from desiccation from the sun, and your organisms will repay you tenfold with added productivity, health, and vigor in your growing conditions. Also, if you cover your soil, the weed seeds have less of a tendency to grow and become less of a problem, reducing immensely the amount of labor that's involved in trying to maintain your garden, keep it weeded, and keep it clear of all of these different materials, right? So we don't want to spend all of our time in our garden, as pleasant as it can be. It shouldn't be a chore. It shouldn't be an unpleasant experience. It should be beautiful. There's a little bit of labor involved in the beginning when you're laying out your mulches and stuff like that, but it saves so much time. It's so worth doing. And basically, these mulches decompose, worms come in and live underneath there, and they're moving up and down in the soil column, creating more tunnels, pooping along the way, manuring it, keeping your soil, making your soil nice and black, beautiful black chocolate cake soil. Seaweed is one of those great mulches, especially in tomatoes, that worms absolutely love. Slugs don't like it because there's a little bit of salt in there, not enough to harm your plants, not enough to harm your earthworms, but slugs don't enjoy it. So they tend to not hang out too much in your seaweed mulch. Seaweed mulch also doesn't have weed seeds like you might have in hay. Or even straw. You can buy straw, but there might be some residues of some of the seeds from the agricultural crop. It might be barley seeds, it might be wheat or whatever it might be. But then these things might end up growing in your garden. I use a lot of hay in my garden. Now, a lot of folks will say, "Well, you need to put hay in your garden; it's just going to be all be weeds," and that's true unless you put it thick enough. So typically, I'll put hay no less than 6 inches deep, and especially on potatoes, I'll put my hay a full 8 foot to 18 inches deep. In time, the hay will compact a little bit, and the plants are going to grow through them. But you if you put it thick enough, it's so thick that the seeds don't have an opportunity to touch the soil and germinate in there, and you end up with a good beautiful soil underneath that. But if you remove your hay, your seeds will be present, and so it's something that you want to watch out for if you're using hay. Sometimes it's a good idea, like at my place where I put hay, especially um, during the winter months. I'll scrape the hay off of the garden beds and put those in my compost, and I'll cover that garden bed with um with a black plastic tarp for the winter months and all of spring until the time I plant. So what happens there is under the black tarp, oftentimes a lot of the weed seeds are going to sprout, and because it's dark, they're going to wilt. You're not going to be able to photosynthesize. So what happens there is it'll take care of the problem of weed seeds. Some weed seeds need light in order to germinate. So as soon as you take your tarp off, a lot of them will sprout. So that's where in the springtime, I'll pull the tarp away from my garden bed and let it open to the sky for about a week. When I see a bunch of weed seeds sprouting all over the place, I just cover it back up, and then they'll wilt without sunlight. They'll be occulted from the sunlight. They'll be in the darkness. They can't grow, and you eliminate those seeds. And you do this after a few years. You basically eliminate the tendency of weeds growing in your garden bed. You have a lot cleaner garden bed, and much less maintenance. I didn't believe it at first when I saw folks suggesting this, but trial and error, believe me, it does do this. And in time, year after year, if you continue this practice of covering your garden beds and preventing weed seeds from sprouting, in time your garden beds just become really rich. They accumulate organic matter if you don't till very often. And weed seeds have a tendency to no longer be so present, and it eliminates a lot of those issues. The beauty of using tarps instead of regular tillage to remove weeds is that it's a much great reduction in labor. So I remember when I used to start gardening, I'd have to till my entire garden every spring, and I'd have to till it once or twice. You till it once, you may add some compost, you till it again to work it into your soil, then you leave it alone for a little bit. Then a bunch of weed seeds and weeds start to grow. You till it once more before you plant, and then you have to make all of your garden rows. So it's a lot of labor. You're there with a hoe and making rows and all of that stuff, and you're reworking your soil 3, 4, 5, or 6 times before you actually put a seed or a seedling in there. But using tarps, basically in the fall, harvest, cut your plants off at the top, leave the roots in the garden, leave it in your soil. That's organic matter that's already there. Why remove it? It's already in place. And besides, plant roots when they die at the end of the year, they decompose in the soil and they act like little sponges and like little rebar that holds your soil structure strong, so that those tiny little tunnels stay open. They don't get compressed, compacted. It and When it rains on top of those stumps left over at the soil surface, those stumps absorb water, and it wicks all that water nice and deep into your soil column. So we really want to have that water infiltrate as deep as possible in our garden soil, so that when our plants grow there, they don't just have little surface roots right at close to the surface that are very vulnerable to dehydration, droughts, and all kinds of issues like that. If we encourage good water and air infiltration, those roots will grow very, very, very deep. So even if the soil surface dries a half inch, an inch even, they're still acquiring water 4, 5, 6, 7, 10 inches down. There's still some a little bit of moisture there. So that'll be the difference between having tomatoes that have blossom end rot or a harvest of beautiful ripe red tomatoes. That's the big difference. Blossom end rot will often happen to a tomato when it gets into cycles of a lot of a lot of rain, a lot of water, and then dries out. Then a lot of rain and water, and then there dries out again. When it dries out, the calcium that's dissolved in the soil dries out with the dry soil and is no longer in solution, and the plant can't access it. So that's what happens.